Hi, and welcome to Chapter 1. Here's what we're going to discuss this chapter. What are some reasons to study communication? What is communication? What are the key components of communication? What does communication look like? What is competent communication? And what are the characteristics of communication? And what are the 5 principles? So, reasons to study. Here are 3 big ones. I'm sure you can think of all sorts of other reasons to study communication too. But employability, relationships, and health are at the top of most people's lists. First, employability. It turns out that in most surveys of not only large companies but small companies too, managers agree and hiring decision makers agree that choosing the right people with the right skills means communication skills. It turns out that communication skills are on the top of the list when it comes to what makes you more employable. And they may not all agree on what kind of communication skills, but all of them agree that communication skills are usually in the top 10, most of the top 10 as a matter of fact, not just in the top 10, but most of the top 10. So whether we're talking about ability to communicate in groups, ability to communicate orally, ability to communicate written, it's all really important to employability, as you might imagine. The second big overarching reason to study communication is, of course, relationships. It turns out that in world survey after world survey, communication and relationships are at the very top of the keys to happiness regardless of culture. That's right, regardless of culture. That's not just in America. Relationships, it turns out, are one of the keys to a much more happy life regardless of where you live in the world. And of course, communication is a proven way to enhance, manage, and improve our relationships. The third and final reason, big reason to study, but of course not the last reason, because you can think of all sorts of other reasons beyond these big 3, is health. Can you think of the last time you weren't able to communicate face-to-face or online? It's probably been a long time, if that. Do you remember how you felt? It actually makes you feel more stressed to not communicate than to communicate. As a matter of fact, communication, when it's effective especially, can serve to reduce stress. So what is communication? Human communication is the process of making sense out of the world and sharing that sense with others by creating meaning through verbal and nonverbal messages. This is a masterful definition. It includes this idea of this process of making sense. And think about how profound that is and how that differentiates us from every other being on this planet. We are able to make sense and share that sense with others and literally create meaning through verbal and nonverbal messages. A simpler definition is human communication is the process of stimulating meaning in the minds of others using verbal and nonverbal messages. So again, think about this. Have you ever had message sent not equal message received? Most of us have. Have you ever said something and you realized that it wasn't translating? You were trying to get your point across, but it just wasn't working. So maybe you reframed and you tried a different way of trying to communicate the same idea and that still didn't work? Most sitcoms are based on this simple premise, right? If the main character of the sitcom would just reframe and communicate better, the entire hilarity of the entire episode probably wouldn't have happened. And that's been true of sitcoms for a long time. That's true of reality shows too. Think about your favorite reality show and how much fun it would be to watch the drama if message sent always equaled message received. It turns out miscommunication is fun to watch. So we can all communicate, but effective communication and messages must be competent. So there are 3 criteria for competent messages. They must be understood, they must achieve the intended effect, they have to understand exactly what you meant, and it has to have the effect you intend, where that effect is persuasion. It could be to get them to do something that you want them to do. to say something you want them to say. It could be just to get them to understand where you're coming from. And of course, ethical. They must be ethical. So what are the key components in our communication models? The source is one component. The source encodes. It's the process of taking those messages in your mind, those ideas, and translating them into the verbal and nonverbal realm. Decoding is where you take the verbal and nonverbal realm and you translate it back into the realm of ideas. The channel can include sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Where have you seen this list before? That's right, elementary school. Those are the 5 senses, right? The 5 senses. It turns out that's a great place to start when you're thinking about how to communicate effectively. What channel do you want to invoke in your nonverbal and verbal language? Okay. Obviously, verbal language, we think of sound, sometimes sight if we're talking about reading the verbal messages, but mainly sound. And of course, sight for the nonverbal. But touch, taste, and smell you wouldn't necessarily think of as communication channels or in communication classes. But it turns out touch, taste, and smell are just as important as the dominant channels we think about when we think about communication and the study of communication. The message can be verbal or nonverbal. The noise can be literal or psychological. Of course, literal noise is like the noise of the car that passes by in the street. It's actual, physical, literal noise. And psychological noise could be you're thinking about right now your next date or your next conversation, and you're planning your next conversation with your roommate, or you're planning your next conversation with your parents. So that psychological noise, there's a whole array of psychological noise that could get in the way of the communication process. Next we have context. Context can be physical, historical, or the psychological environment as we just discussed, right? The physical and historical context can lend value to the communication happening in that particular context. Would you communicate the same way in a classroom as you would in your residence hall room? Of course not. Would you communicate the same way in the library as you would a bar? Of course not, right? And of course the feedback loop is that constant loop of information, both seen and heard from one person to another. So for example, vocal nonverbal cues like uh-huh and yeah and oh okay, those sorts of things create that feedback loop between the source and the receiver. So what does communication look like? Here are 3 different models. We're going to break down these models and give you an image for each one. The first is communication as action. And that's another word for that is message transfer. Communication as interaction is the next. Another word for that is message exchange. Communication as transaction is like message creation. So remember the big ideas here. Communication is action, interaction, and transaction. So the first one is action or message transfer. And this is an older model, right? This is an older way we used to think about communication. And it starts from a source to a receiver, and that's it. The next is communication as interaction and messaging exchange. So instead of having just from source to receiver and that's it, you now have the introduction of this concept of it's not just source receiver, it's receiver back to source. So you can imagine a packet of information being sent from the source to the receiver and then back, and then that's it. The key to understanding interaction is its simplicity. And of course we have human communication as transaction or message creation. And this is simultaneous. It's not just message sent, message received, stop, as with our first model. Our message sent, message received, message sent, message received, and then stop, as with our second model. Here, messages are being passed between the source and the receiver simultaneously. And that's the big difference. It's simultaneous. It's always happening. And think about how you communicate face to face. If this were a face-to-face conversation, you would have the verbal and the nonverbal, right? I would be seeing the nonverbal and you would be listening to the verbal and the nonverbal simultaneously. If you were to nod your head, it might indicate that I should move on to the next part of this discussion, right? If you were to raise your hand, that would indicate that I maybe needed to clarify something. And of course, communication is transaction. It's all about that simultaneous nature of communication. Mediated communication can include all sorts of different dimensions. And your book does a great job of discussing 4 dimensions. So we have anonymity, personal appearance, distance, and time. And time can be asynchronous or synchronous. Synchronous means at the same time, asynchronous means not at the same time. So tools like email would be a great example of asynchronous. A tool like a live interactive chat would be a synchronous tool. So whether you're using Facebook, Google+, MySpace, whatever dimension of computer communication you're using, not just social networking tools. These are dimensions that we can look at. So the first one, back to the first one, now that we talked about time, is anonymity. Anonymity in the sense that we don't have the same sense of responsibility to our online personas as we would to our personal face-to-face personas. There's a degree of anonymity there. And that degree of anonymity also includes whenever you're representing yourself. That underlying dimension of not actually being there because you're online. The next is personal appearance, and of course personal appearance is far more important in face-to-face interactions than in online interactions. And that's not to negate the importance of personal appearance in online interactions. I'm sure you've all heard the stories of people getting fired based on their social networking accounts. So personal appearance is important in both spaces, but it's far more important in those face-to-face conversations because there's just way more information being transmitted. The next is distance, and of course, technology allows us to communicate over vast distances, and it helps to close those distances and make those distances less of an obstacle to communication. And we've already discussed time. So here are communication characteristics. Communication is inescapable. You cannot not communicate. There's no way to escape it. Just walking into a room where there is at least one other individual means you're communicating. Not necessarily verbally, but possibly non-verbally. It's irreversible. Once you say something, it cannot be unsaid. And you can temper that with, well, I didn't mean to say that, and I'm so sorry I said that, or I can't believe I said that, I was just kidding, or hey, just kidding. It can be complicated. As you can imagine, there are all sorts of complexities that happen whenever human beings try to create and share meanings. And that sense-making process can get real messy and real complicated. It's content and relationship oriented. What that means is content in the sense of the verbal realm, relationship in the sense of the nonverbal realm. One is focused on what is said, the other one's focused on how it's said. So when we talk about verbal communication, we're going to focus on content. When we talk about nonverbal communication, we're going to focus on the relationship. Because it turns out both dimensions are very, very important. Of course, it's governed by rules. There are rules that we learn by watching other people communicate. We learn those rules as we grow up. We learn those from our very first daycare or kindergarten experience, and we modify our understanding of those rules as we encounter other human beings in life. These 5 communication principles are going to guide us through this semester. They really are wonderful things to keep in mind regardless of where you are or who you're communicating with. So the first one there is be aware of your communication. The second one is effectively use and interpret verbal messages. The third is effectively use and interpret nonverbal messages. The fourth is listen and respond thoughtfully to others. And the fifth is appropriately adapt your message to others. All five principles will be applied to the interpersonal context, the small group context, and the presentational speaking context. Each of these principles are things that are very, very important to focus on for more effective living. One of the most famous communication theorists, Kenneth Burke, argued that communication is equipment for living. And I can't imagine a better toolbox than these five principles to better equip you for a better life.